Counting glass. That was what Agnes Bowman was doing at 9:30 on the night of Lord Harcastle's annual winter assembly. Counting the crystal stems in the East Corridor cabinet, cross-referencing the tally against the housekeeper's inventory she had memorized 3 days prior, because Mrs. Firth had put 12 glasses into service for the evening, and the cabinet showed only 9 upon inspection, and someone would need to account for the difference before the footman cleared the last table. Agnes counted quietly. She pressed one finger to each stem in turn, moving from left to right along the shelf, while 60 feet away in the ballroom, the assembled nobility of 3 counties danced beneath chandelier light, so dense it made the whole space look like something inside a watch. All moving parts and gold. The ballroom at Harcastle Park was, by any measure, a studied exercise in excess. The chandeliers alone held 340 candles, replaced fresh each evening at the direction of the late Lady Harcastle, a tradition her husband maintained as though abandoning it would require him to admit she was gone. The walls were ivory silk damask. The floor was black and white Italian marble, polished weekly by a team of 4 who spoke to no one about their work. The flowers, Agnes had arranged them herself in the 3 hours between supper service and the first carriage, were white hothouse roses banked against fern and dark ivy, 12 arrangements in 12 alcoves, so precisely spaced that a guest moving from one end of the room to the other would never stand more than 8 feet from a bloom. Guests arrived in silks the color of storm clouds and evening water. They smiled the smiles of people who had prepared their smiles before leaving home. And at the edge of all that calculated magnificence, one hand resting against the cabinet shelf and an inventory list folded in her apron pocket, was Agnes Bowman. She was 26. She wore black, as she always wore black, not mourning black, merely the black of a woman who had made her uniform into something invisible on purpose. Her hair was pinned with the efficiency of a person who had learned early that elaborate arrangements invited attention she could not afford. She was not plain, she was not beautiful, she was the sort of woman a room does not quite see, and she had long ago decided that this was its own kind of advantage. She found the missing glasses. 2 had been taken to the music alcove at the end of the East Corridor, set on a tray beside the small upright piano that no one had touched in 14 years. Apparently by a footman who had misread the evening's floor plan. Agnes relocated them to the cabinet, updated her mental count, and moved on to check the flower arrangements in the south anteroom, because one of the roses in the 3rd alcove had been listing at a 5-degree angle since 7 o'clock, and it would continue to bother her until she had corrected it. She was straightening the stem, pressing her thumb gently against the base of the arrangement to re-angle the bloom, when the main doors at the far end of the corridor opened, and the cold came in. Not the cold of winter exactly, though it was December and the drive was frosted. The cold that preceded James Alderton, the Duke of Denvale, was the kind that rooms produced when they collectively understood that someone was entering who would not be charmed by them. He was announced, in the ballroom, by a footman whose voice carried all the way to the anteroom. Agnes heard it without turning. She had known he was expected. She had seen his name on the guest register that morning, when she had reviewed the seating plans for supper. The Duke of Denvale, 34 years old, unmarried, 6 years in withdrawal from London society following the death of his mother, the Duchess Eleanor, who had died of a fever in the winter of 1817, and taken, by most accounts, the only warmth the Alderton household had ever possessed. Agnes finished correcting the flower, and stepped back to assess the arrangement. Straight now, she moved along the anteroom to check the 4th alcove. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were deliberate, the step of a man who had decided where he was going before he took the first step, and who had no particular interest in being noticed along the way. When he appeared in the anteroom doorway, he was looking at a point somewhere past Agnes, and then he stopped, because she was there, and he recalibrated without any apparent surprise. He was precisely as described and entirely unlike what she had imagined from a description. Tall. Dark coat of a quality that did not require comment. No ornament, no decorative flourish, no pin in his cravat, no ring. He wore authority the way a well-built bridge bears weight, without performance, simply because it was built to do so. His face was composed in an expression that was not unkind, but also clearly not engaged. He looked at Agnes with the measuring attention of a man who had just noticed something he had not accounted for. "You are not a guest," he said. It was not a question. "No, Your Grace," Agnes said. She had turned to face him with the same steadiness she gave to everything. "I manage the household staff for Lord Harcastle's events. I was checking the flower arrangements." He looked at the roses she had just corrected. Then he looked back at her. The look lasted slightly longer than social convention required, not in any way that could be called inappropriate, more the way a person reads a sentence twice when they believe they may have misunderstood it. "That one was listing," he said. "It was," Agnes said. "It is straight now." He looked at her for one more moment, measuring, quiet, as though she were a figure in an account that had not resolved to the number he expected, and then he moved past her into the corridor toward the ballroom. Agnes watched him go. She pressed her thumb once against the edge of the flower arrangement to confirm it was secure, then unfolded her inventory list and moved on to the next item. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. Agnes Bowman had been managing Lord Harcastle's household operations for 4 years, 5 months, and 11 days. Before that, she had managed her father's estate for 3 years from the age of 17, after his health declined, and his solicitor made it quietly known that the cost of professional management would require selling one of the tenant farms. Before that, she had kept her father's accounts since she was 14, initially because he had asked her to check his figures, then because she was faster and more accurate than the man he was paying 12 shillings a month to do it, and he had eventually admitted this to himself if not to anyone else. Her father, Thomas Bowman, had been a wool merchant of moderate standing, not a gentleman, not quite a tradesman, occupying the precise social position that offered none of the protections of either category. He was a good man who had loved his daughter with more sincerity than structure, who had taught her to read accounts before she could properly manage a needle and thread, and who had died in the autumn of 1814, leaving behind a household, 2 tenant farms, a moderate debt to a creditor in Bristol, and a brother-in-law named Geoffrey Ashworth, who arrived within a fortnight of the funeral to assess the situation. Geoffrey Ashworth was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who believed the world was organized correctly, and that the correct organization placed him in charge of decisions, and Agnes in charge of making tea. He assessed the estate, noted that it was in better order than he had expected, assumed this was the result of Thomas Bowman's good instincts, and began to make plans. He would install his eldest son as manager of the tenant farms. He would find Agnes a suitable position, a companion perhaps to a respectable widow, something appropriate and undemanding for a young woman of her situation. Agnes had spent 2 weeks watching this unfold. She had been 17 years, 4 months old. She had been managing her father's estate, all of it, the tenant farm leases, the creditor negotiations, the wool merchant account cycles, the household expenditure, since she was 15. She had brought the Bristol debt down from £63 to £29 in 8 months by negotiating a revised payment schedule and finding a secondary buyer for the spring clip who was willing to pay 4 shillings more per stone. She had done all of this without a title, without credit, and without anyone in the wider world knowing she had done it at all. She was not going to step aside for a man who had arrived 2 weeks after her father's death and begun speaking about her future as though she were a piece of furniture to be rehomed. She had sat down with Geoffrey Ashworth in the morning room and laid the estate accounts across the table. The figures were clean, annotated, organized by quarter. She had walked him through them for 45 minutes. She had shown him the Bristol creditor correspondence, the tenant farm income, the adjusted margin projections for the following 2 years. She had been entirely calm throughout. When she finished, she had said, "This estate is solvent and well managed. If you install someone without knowledge of these accounts and these relationships, it will not remain so. I am prepared to remain as manager, with a formal agreement and a proper salary. That is my request." Geoffrey Ashworth had looked at her for a long time. He was not a man who enjoyed being surprised, and she had surprised him completely. He had agreed, not because he thought it was appropriate, but because the figures were undeniable, and he was, at his core, a practical man who preferred not to oversee a failing estate when a functioning one was available. She had managed the estate for 2 more years under that agreement. Then Geoffrey's eldest son turned 20, and the arrangement became untenable, for reasons that had nothing to do with Agnes's performance. She had accepted this with the resignation of someone who had known it was coming. She left with a reference letter from Geoffrey Ashworth that was precise but not warm, her father's annotated account ledgers, and £12 she had saved from her salary. She arrived at Harcastle Park in the spring of 1815, seeking a position as housekeeper's assistant. Mrs. Firth had interviewed her for 40 minutes and given her the role, saying afterwards, though Agnes only learned this later, from the kitchen maid, that she had never interviewed a candidate who had already read the household inventory before arriving. Agnes had found the inventory in a publicly accessible record at the county offices. She had been thorough. She was always thorough. She had been promoted to events manager within 18 months, a role Lord Harcastle acknowledged, primarily by paying her £11 per annum more than her predecessor. She organized the winter assembly, the spring luncheons, the harvest dinner, the occasional ball. She managed the suppliers, flowers from the Thicket nursery, extra linen from a merchant in York she had sourced herself, because the previous supplier's quality had declined 2 years running, wine from a Bordeaux importer whose credit terms she had renegotiated in 1818, to save Lord Harcastle £40 annually. She tracked the household accounts, caught a discrepancy in the silver inventory in March of 1819 that turned out to be the result of a footman selling individual pieces, and managed the dismissal quietly and without scandal. She did not receive credit for most of this by name. The events were praised. The household ran smoothly. Lord Harcastle was considered a generous and capable host. The person running his household was considered, by the guests, not at all. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. There had been one moment, in the second winter at Harcastle, when Agnes had understood completely how invisible she had become. A guest, a countess from Yorkshire, had stopped her in the corridor to ask where she might find Mrs. Firth. Agnes had told her. The countess had thanked her without looking at her face. Not rudely, simply with the casual inattention of someone who considered a woman in black, moving efficiently through a corridor, to be a feature of the architecture rather than a person. Agnes had returned to the linen room, pressed one hand flat against the cold wall for a moment, and then gone back to work. She was not going to become less than she was because the world kept failing to look. She had been looking at the roses when the Duke of Denvale arrived. She had been thorough. The Duke of Denvale did not, as a rule, attend events he had not arranged specifically. He attended the Harcastle Winter Assembly for 2 reasons. Lord Harcastle's estate shared a border with Denvale's southern property, and there was a matter of a drainage easement that required conversation in a social context before it could become a legal one. He had no interest in the dancing. He had no interest in the display of unmarried daughters of the county nobility, each arrived in a gown that cost more than a tenant farmer's annual wage, each smiling with the particular bright calculation of women who had been taught that this room, this season, was what their worth would be decided by. He found the whole machinery of it so familiar and so exhausting that he moved through it as though it were a task to be completed before he could return to something real. Denvale House had been real, once. His mother had made it so. Eleanor Alderton had been a woman who played the piano the way some people breathed, not for performance, but because silence was not her natural condition. She had played in the early mornings before the household properly stirred, in the evenings after the guests had gone, sometimes in the middle of the night when something was troubling her and she could not settle it in her mind. She had been a woman of precise feeling and inexhaustible warmth, and she had died of a fever at 51, in the winter of 1817, and James Alderton had been in London when it happened, and had not arrived in time, and that was all he would think about that, ever, because thinking about it in more specific terms was something he refused to do. He had withdrawn from London after the funeral. He had managed the estate, the 6 tenant farms, the investment portfolio, the capital improvements he had been planning for 18 months. He had done all of it correctly. He had done none of it from any feeling other than obligation. His father, the previous duke, had died 4 years before Eleanor, leaving behind a household that ran on efficient formality and very little else. James had inherited both the title and the emotional climate. He was not his mother's son in any way that was visible from the outside, and he had spent a number of years making peace with this. He had come to Harcastle to discuss a drainage easement. He had found, in the anteroom, a woman in black straightening a rose, with the focused attention of someone for whom this single task was, in that moment, the only task in the world. He did not know what to make of this. He had made an observation about the flower because it was accurate, and because he had noticed it, and he was not, despite appearances, a man who withheld accurate observations out of social convention. She had confirmed his observation without surprise or gratitude, which he found, for a reason he could not immediately place, interesting. He discussed the drainage easement with Lord Harcastle before supper. He danced once, with Lady Harcastle, who was 53 and kind, and who told him quietly that she hoped he would begin coming out again, because the county was better for having him in it, which was the nicest thing anyone had said to him in several months. He watched the room during the supper interval, from his position near the east wall, in the way he always watched rooms, as systems, as arrangements of moving parts, looking for what was actually operating beneath the visible surface. He saw her twice more, once carrying a small writing case through the north corridor with the walk of someone who knew precisely where they were going, once standing with Lord Harcastle's steward in the doorway of the east service corridor, listening, nodding once, and producing from her apron pocket a folded document that she handed to the steward with a short comment. The steward read it, nodded. The matter, whatever it had been, was concluded. James Alderton noted these observations the way he noted the drainage contours on a survey map, not with feeling, but with the particular attention of someone who is building an accurate picture of something they do not yet fully understand. He returned to Denvale House 11 days later and wrote a letter to Lord Harcastle. The letter concerned the drainage easement and included, in its final paragraph, a specific and polite inquiry, the name and full history of the woman who managed his household events, and whether Lord Harcastle would consider releasing her from her position should the right arrangement be proposed. Lord Harcastle, who was a good-natured man and who privately considered Agnes one of the most efficient members of his household, and who also genuinely liked the Duke of Denvale and wished him well, wrote back within the week with Agnes Bowman's full history as he knew it, which was detailed and complimentary, and a note at the end that he would not stand in her way if a better situation were offered, because he was of the opinion that Agnes Bowman had been operating above her official station for some years, and he felt a degree of guilt about this that he had never quite addressed. James filed the letter. He had his man, an investigator he had used for estate disputes, compile what additional background was available. The investigator returned with confirmation of the Ashworth estate history, the Bristol creditor correspondence, which had apparently been preserved in the county solicitor's records, and a notation that Miss Bowman was well regarded by every supplier and creditor who had dealt with her in a professional capacity, that she had no debts, no dependents, and had been living for 4.5 years on £11 per annum above the base housekeeper rate, which the investigator observed, as a side note, was insufficient by any standard for the scope of work she was actually doing. James read the report twice. Then he made a decision. He had been making decisions his whole life the way his father had taught him: late, private, and final. This one was no different. He wrote a second letter. This one was addressed directly to Agnes Bowman. He proposed, in the letter, a position. He required a house manager for Denvale House, someone with full administrative authority over the estate household operations, which had been running on a skeleton arrangement since his mother's death, and were, he admitted without excessive detail, in a poor condition. The salary was £120 annually. The position included rooms, meals, and independent authority over the household account, to a limit of £50 without requiring his approval. He asked her to consider it, and to reply at her convenience. He did not explain why he had chosen her specifically. He had done his research. That was explanation enough, for him. Whether it would be explanation enough for her, he was prepared to wait to learn. Agnes received the letter on a Tuesday morning in January. She read it in the housekeeper's office, standing, because she had been between tasks and had not had the occasion to sit. She read it twice. She set it down on the desk. She went and completed her morning tasks, which included checking the coal delivery and resolving a disagreement between the kitchen staff about the order of service for an upcoming luncheon. Then she came back and read the letter a third time. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it with the same systematic care she brought to a creditor negotiation or a revised floor plan. £120 annually was more than she had ever been paid for anything. Full administrative authority was not something she had ever officially held. Denvale House was a ducal estate, which meant it was an institution of serious operational complexity, which meant there was a real and interesting problem to be solved there. She was aware that the position's offer was unusual, that a duke offering this kind of role to a woman of her station and background was irregular, and that she did not yet know why he had done it. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She was not counting on this as rescue. She was counting it as an operational calculation. Her skills, his need, and a salary that would allow her, for the first time in her adult life, to be adequately compensated for the work she actually did. She wrote back on Thursday. She accepted. She asked one specific question. Could she review the current household accounts before she assumed the role, so as to understand the starting condition? She wanted no surprises she could have avoided. He sent the accounts by post the following morning, which was not the pace of a man who had doubted her answer. She reviewed the accounts over 2 evenings. They were not catastrophically disordered, the estate was not in debt, but they showed 4 years of deferred maintenance, outdated supplier contracts, and an inventory system that was functioning on the memory of whoever happened to have been there longest, rather than any documented record. There was also an unaccounted gap of some £93 in the household expenditure for 1820, which was not properly explained in any column she could locate. She made notes. She arrived at Denvale House on the first Monday of February, carrying a leather document case her father had given her, a notebook, and the account records she had been sent. Mrs. Laura Whitmore, the housekeeper who had been managing alone since the last events manager had departed 18 months prior, met Agnes at the service entrance. She was 60, direct, and had the compressed expression of someone who had been doing more than their official job for long enough that they had given up expecting relief. "You'll have found the gap in the 20 accounts," she said, before Agnes had removed her coat. £93, Agnes said. "Do you know what it covers?" Mrs. Whitmore looked at her with the careful attention of someone calibrating whether to trust. "I know exactly what it covers," she said. "Come and have tea." The gap, it turned out, covered a series of payments made by the previous estate steward, a man named Coldest, now departed, to a supplier in Norwich, who had been overcharging for household linen at a rate of 15% above market for 3 consecutive years. Coldest had not been deliberately dishonest, Mrs. Whitmore believed, but he had been lazy, and his laziness had cost the estate money, and when he had left, the discrepancy had not been properly surfaced to the Duke, because no one had wanted to present a problem without a solution. Agnes made a note. She liked problems that came with that much background already assembled. She thanked Mrs. Whitmore, drank her tea, and said she would have a preliminary household review completed within a fortnight. She had it completed in 9 days. The other woman who complicated Agnes's arrival at Denvale was not Mrs. Whitmore, who was an ally from the first cup of tea, and was not any member of the household staff, who received Agnes with the cautious goodwill of people who had been underserved and knew it. The complication was Lady Cecilia Forsyth, who arrived at Denvale House on the 3rd afternoon of Agnes's tenure, announced by a footman who was clearly accustomed to her arrivals, in a carriage that had been designed for visibility and achieved it. Lady Cecilia was 24, blonde, perfectly dressed in blue wool, and possessed of the serene confidence of a woman who had been told by everyone who mattered that she was the appropriate choice for a very particular position. She was, in social terms, the anticipated Duchess of Denvale, not officially, not yet, but by general understanding, by the agreement of family solicitors, by 3 years of careful cultivation of the Duke's social adjacency, and by the publicly stated preference of James Alderton's paternal uncle, Lord Alderton of Whitmore, who had been managing the Denvale marital question since James turned 30 and shown no apparent interest in resolving it himself. Lady Cecilia arrived in the drawing room, where Agnes had been reviewing the revised supplier contracts she intended to present to the Duke, and stopped when she saw her. "You must be the new house manager," Lady Cecilia said. with the particular inflection of someone inserting the word new to do the work of temporary. Agnes Bowman, Agnes said. She set her papers in order and stood. I believe Mrs. Whitmore was expecting you. I can take you through. I know where the drawing room is, Lady Cecilia said. She was looking at the contracts spread across the table. That is a great deal of paperwork for a household position. The previous supply contracts were outdated, Agnes said. I am preparing revised terms. She kept her voice entirely even. This was not difficult. She had been managing this specific kind of conversation since she was 17. Shall I let Mrs. Whitmore know you have arrived? Lady Cecilia turned her full attention on Agnes for the first time. It was a measuring look, and not unintelligent. Lady Cecilia was not a foolish woman. She was a woman who had been prepared by her world to occupy a certain position, and who recognized, with an accuracy she would not have named aloud, that Agnes Bowman was something that did not fit the expected categories. The Duke has made an unusual choice, Lady Cecilia said finally. His Grace has made a practical one, Agnes said. The household required someone with operational experience. If you will excuse me. She gathered her papers without any particular haste and went to find Mrs. Whitmore. She did not look back. She had a great deal of work to do, and Lady Cecilia's assessment of the appropriateness of her appointment was not a problem Agnes was responsible for solving. The Duke arrived at Denvale House 4 days after Agnes. He came in the early afternoon, without announcement, or rather, with the announcement that his own household afforded him, which was the sound of a horse in the yard, and the particular activity in the front hall that meant the master was back. Agnes was in the estate office reviewing the revised supplier documents when Mrs. Whitmore knocked to tell her. She gathered her preliminary report, 10 pages, organized by category, with the £93 discrepancy documented, and a proposed resolution in the 3rd section, and went to present it. He was in the study, coat still on, reading a letter that he set aside when she appeared in the doorway. He looked at her with the same measuring attention he had given her in the Harcastle anteroom. Not surprise. More the recalibration of someone who had constructed an expectation and was now adjusting it to match reality. You arrived on Monday, he said. I did. She stepped inside, left the door open, and placed the report on the edge of the desk facing him. I have completed a preliminary review. I can walk you through it or leave it for your reading. The account discrepancy is documented in Section 3, with a proposed resolution. I have also drafted revised terms for 4 of the current supply contracts. I believe we can recover approximately £80 annually in material costs without reducing service quality. He picked up the report. He turned to the 3rd section without preamble. He read it. Agnes waited. Coldest, he said. The overcharging appears to have been the supplier's initiative rather than deliberate collusion, Agnes said. I cannot say that with certainty, but the record suggests Coldest failed to check market rates rather than actively concealing anything. The resolution I have proposed involves recovering what is possible through the supplier's current contract terms, which include a clause about material accuracy of invoicing. He read further. He turned to Section 7, which was the supply contract analysis. He read that. He set the report down and looked at her. You found a recovery clause in a contract that has been sitting in this office for 3 years, he said. The clause is in standard terms, Agnes said. It was simply not used. He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone who was deciding something they had already mostly decided. You asked to see the accounts before you arrived, he said. I did not want surprises I could have avoided. She met his gaze without difficulty. I find it is better to understand the starting condition. Sit down, Miss Bowman, he said. He pulled a second chair to the desk angle, not across from him, beside him, which was the arrangement of people working on the same problem rather than facing each other as adversaries. Walk me through the supply contract revision. She walked him through it for 40 minutes. He asked 3 questions, each of which she had anticipated and had answers prepared for. He was not testing her. The questions were genuine. He was a man who wanted to understand the mechanics of what he had been told and asked the most direct route to that understanding. When she finished, he said, The annual coal contract. You have proposed splitting it between 2 suppliers. The current supplier has a monopoly position and knows it, Agnes said. Introducing a secondary supplier for 20% of the volume will rebalance the negotiation for next year's contract. It will cost slightly more this season. It will cost considerably less across 3 years. He looked at her. 3 years, he said. That is my projection, based on the pattern of increases in the current contract across the last 5 years. He did not say anything for a moment. He simply looked at the supply contract document and then at the coal contract amendment she had drafted. He reached out and turned the page. He read the amendment. "This is good work," he said. It was not enthusiastic. It was the precise observation of someone stating an accurate fact. It landed, because of its precision, more squarely than praise would have. Agnes said, "Thank you, Your Grace." She collected the papers he had finished reviewing and added them to her case. "I will bring the revised supplier terms to you for signature when I have the final versions drafted. I expect within the week." She was at the study door before he spoke again. "The gap in the £93, he said. "You documented every item." "Yes. Including the ones that made Coldest look careless rather than dishonest." She turned. He was looking at the report, not at her. "He was careless, not dishonest," she said. "The document should reflect what is accurate." He turned a page. It would have been simpler to present it as dishonesty. The outcome for the recovery is the same. "I do not present things inaccurately because it is simpler," Agnes said. "If you require someone who does, I may not be the correct appointment." He looked up at her then, the measuring attention again. But something in it had shifted, like a calculation resolving to a different figure than expected. "No," he said quietly. "You are the correct appointment." She went back to the estate office. She allowed herself, in the privacy of the corridor, to press one hand briefly against the wall. Then she opened her notebook and went back to work. She had managed Jeffrey Ashworth's estate accounts alone at 17. She could manage this. The weeks that followed were the most operationally absorbing of Agnes's professional life. Denvale House was large, complex, and had been running for 4 years on institutional momentum and Mrs. Whitmore's considerable personal knowledge. But institutional momentum was not documentation, and personal knowledge died with its holder, and the first structural change Agnes made was to sit with Mrs. Whitmore for 2 hours each morning and write down everything the housekeeper knew about how the house actually functioned, building the operational record that should have existed years before. Mrs. Whitmore submitted to this with the air of someone who had been trying to say a thing for a long time and was relieved to finally be asked. She knew everything. She knew which tenant farms had drainage problems that predated the current lessees. She knew which suppliers could be trusted to deliver on time, and which ones required a written reminder. She knew that the East Wing's plaster had a water ingress problem that had been observed in 1818 and never properly addressed, and that the library chimney drew badly because a bird had nested in the upper flue in 1819, and the nest had never been fully removed. Agnes wrote all of it down. She documented, organized, cross-referenced. She built the household record from the ground up in 6 weeks. The Duke was in residence most of this time, which she had not expected. He had the quality of a man who worked, and worked seriously, and he moved through the estate with the focused attention of someone who saw everything but commented on very little. He occasionally appeared in the estate office to look at whatever she was doing, without invitation and without apparent agenda, standing in the doorway for a moment, reading the title of whatever document was on the desk, and then moving on. She found she did not mind this. He was not intrusive. He was simply present. There was a morning in the 3rd week when he arrived in the office carrying 2 cups of tea and set one at her elbow without comment. She had been working for 2 hours and had not, she admitted to herself, thought about tea. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. He had already sat down across the desk and was reading the structural survey she had commissioned for the East Wing. "The plasterer's estimate," he said, turning a page. "Is this the man from the village or the firm in York?" "The village," Agnes said. "The York firm's estimate was £22 more for equivalent work. The difference is not justified by the scope." He turned another page. He drank his tea. She drank hers. They worked in the same room for another hour, without it being uncomfortable. She had been at Denvale for 5 weeks when she found the secondary account. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had been completing a routine audit of the household expenditure records for the previous 8 years, trying to establish a baseline for the budget revision she was preparing. The secondary account appeared in the 1817 records. A separate expense column, small entries, 12 in number across the year, totaling £31. The entries were labeled only personal in the steward's hand. Agnes cross-referenced against the household inventory. The amounts did not match any supplier, any repair, any domestic expense she could identify. She went to the estate archive, a set of bound ledger volumes that lived in the study cupboard and that she had been given access to by the Duke's quiet permission, and found the equivalent records for 1816 and 1815. The same column, the same handwriting, the same label, personal. She was working on this in the late evening when the Duke appeared in the doorway. It was past 9. The house had gone quiet around her and she had not noticed. "You are still here," he said. "I found something in the 1817 records." She turned the ledger to face him. He came and stood beside the desk to look. This close, she could see the slight loosening of his collar. He had removed his cravat at some point in the evening, and the top button of his shirt was unfastened, and he looked, for the first time since she had arrived, like a man who was simply himself, rather than a duke performing his duties. It was a small thing. It stayed with her. He looked at the secondary account entries. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "My mother's accounts." "I believe so," Agnes said carefully. "The entries do not match any household or estate expense I can identify. The amount in 1817 decreases after March." She let the implication stand without drawing it. He sat down in the chair across from her, not with any drama, simply because the revelation required sitting down. He looked at the ledger for a long time. "She maintained her own accounts," he said. "I did not know the record survived." "The steward preserved them in the household archive," Agnes said. "He labeled them personal to keep them distinct from estate expenditure. I believe he was protecting them." Something moved across the Duke's face. Not grief exactly. Or not only grief. Something older and more structural. Like a wall that has borne weight so long, it has begun to settle into the shape of it. He looked at the entries. He did not say anything for some time. Agnes waited. She was good at waiting. "She played the piano every morning," he said eventually. It was not addressed to Agnes specifically. It was the statement of someone organizing a fact they have been holding alone for a long time. Before the household rose. "I used to lie in bed and listen. I could not tell you now what she played. I wish I could." Agnes said nothing. She recognized that this was not a moment that required her to speak. After another moment he reached out and closed the ledger carefully, with the specific care of someone handling something they do not want to damage. He pushed it a few inches toward Agnes, which she understood to mean that she should continue to keep it. He stood. He looked at his cravat, which he had evidently left on the corner of the desk when he removed it, and picked it up without apparent embarrassment. "It is late," he said. "Yes," Agnes said. "I will complete the audit review in the morning." He nodded. He was at the door when he stopped. "Miss Bowman," he said without turning, "the accounts you have recovered this month, the revised supplier terms, the East Wing repair, the documentation of the household operations." A pause. "Lord Harcastle did not credit you for any of this." It was not a question. "He credited the household," Agnes said, "which is as it should be." "No," the Duke said. "It is not." He went out. Agnes looked at the closed door for a moment. She picked up her pen and made a note in her review document. Then she sat quite still for the length of time it took the candle to burn down another inch, which was approximately the time she needed to understand what had just shifted. It was not rescue, she reminded herself. She was not going to call it rescue, but it was the first time in her professional life that someone with the authority to change the record had said directly that the record was wrong. She straightened her spine. She went back to work. Lord Alderton of Whitmore arrived at Denvale House on the last Friday of February, with a letter, a coach, and the expression of a man who had decided to address a situation before it became a problem. He was 58, authoritative, and had the bearing of someone who had been the most senior person in every room he had entered for 30 years, and found this entirely appropriate. He walked into the house without being announced. He was family, and the footman knew it, and found Agnes in the entrance hall reviewing a delivery manifest. He stopped. He assessed her in the way she had seen men of his type assess her before, efficiently and without warmth, arriving at a conclusion before asking a single question. "You are the Bowman woman," he said. "Agnes Bowman," she said. She did not put down the manifest. "His Grace is in the East Wing, reviewing the plastering work. I can send someone to let him know you are here." Lord Alderton looked at the manifest in her hands, at the stack of supplier documents under her arm, at the systematic ease with which she stood in his nephew's entrance hall, as though she had always been there. "My nephew has brought a woman of no name and no connection into this household in an official capacity," he said. "I should like to understand his reasoning." "His Grace's reasoning is better asked of him," Agnes said pleasantly. "Shall I send someone through?" Lord Alderton moved past her without answering, in the direction of the East Wing. Agnes sent a footman after him, at a quiet word, turned back to the manifest, and finished the delivery count. She heard, at the far end of the house, the sound of two voices, the Duke's measured and low, Lord Alderton's louder and more irregular. She did not listen. It was not her conversation to have, and she had 37 line items still to verify on the manifest. The conversation lasted an hour. She knew this because she had moved to the estate office by then, and could hear, at intervals, the variation in Lord Alderton's voice. He was not shouting. He was too much a gentleman for that. But he was pressing his point with the repeated insistence of a man who believed that patience would eventually move an immovable object. The Duke came to the estate office afterward. He sat down. He looked, Agnes thought, the way a well-built bridge looks after bearing a heavy load. Exactly the same, because it was built to bear it. "My uncle objects to your appointment," he said. "I assumed as much. He believes the household requires a properly credentialed steward, and that the events management can be handled by Lord Harcastle's loan of Mrs. Firth on occasion." He looked at the document on her desk. "He does not know that Mrs. Firth's knowledge of Denvale's accounts is zero, and that you have recovered £340 in identified inefficiencies in 6 weeks. "Would it help him to know?" Agnes asked. The Duke considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Not immediately," he said. "He is not a man who is moved by facts that arrive before he is ready for them." He paused. "He will be moved by results. If the estate accounts for the coming year show material improvement, he will not dismantle an arrangement that is working." Agnes nodded. This was the most useful form of opposition, principled, practical, and ultimately navigable. "Then we will show him the results," she said. "We," the Duke said. It was not an echo, it was a notation. "The estate's results," Agnes corrected, without heat. He almost smiled. She would not have called it a smile exactly. A slight adjustment in the set of his mouth, a shift in the quality of his stillness that suggested something had moved through him quietly. "The estate's results," he agreed. He did not leave the office immediately. He looked at the supply contract drafts on her desk. "The coal contract," he said. "You anticipated Lord Alderton's objection to the secondary supplier." "I documented the 3-year projection," Agnes said. She pulled the relevant page from her files and set it before him. "The numbers make the case without me needing to make it." He looked at the page. He turned it once, he set it back. "You do not argue," he said. "Arguments can be denied," Agnes said. "Documents cannot." He looked at her with the measuring attention she had come to recognize, the look that meant he was adding something to a calculation he was running. "No," he said, "they cannot." Lord Alderton came to find Agnes himself that afternoon. He came to the estate office and stood in the doorway in the manner of a man who considered entering a professional acknowledgement he was not yet prepared to make. Agnes looked up from her work. She waited. "The East Wing repair," he said. "James tells me you identified the problem and arranged the survey." "The ingress was documented in Mrs. Whitmore's knowledge of the house," Agnes said. I simply formalized the record and engaged the plasterer. Lord Alderton looked at the shelves of organized ledgers, the filed supplier contracts, the annotated household inventory on the desk. He was a man who understood estate management. He could read an organized office. He looked at it for a long moment. The accounts my nephew sent me showed the household surplus for the previous 4 years, averaging £62, he said. He tells me your preliminary projection for this year is 140. Based on the recovered supplier margins and the corrected expenditure categories, Agnes said. Yes. Lord Alderton was quiet. It was not the silence of a man conceding. It was the silence of a man who was reorganizing his position around new information, not because he wanted to, but because he was too precise a thinker to refuse a figure that held up. You came from a wool merchant's household, he said. My father's estate, Agnes said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment longer. Something in his expression, not warmth, but the absence of active opposition, shifted slightly. The house looks better, he said, and walked away. She had not expected warmth. She would not have trusted warmth from him. The absence of active opposition was, from Lord Alderton of Whitmore, a form of concession that meant more than it appeared. She returned to the supply contracts. There was an evening in the 6th week when the Duke came to find her in the music room. She had not been playing. She had been there because the inventory count required her to verify the condition of 3 items in the music room cabinet, and she had lingered after completing the count, because the room was quiet, and it was 9 in the evening, and she allowed herself, in the evenings, a small and private stillness before returning to her rooms. The piano was there. She had not touched it. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, then at the piano. You play, he said. It was not entirely a question. She had never told him this. She had been careful, in fact, not to mention it, because she understood that the piano at Denvale was not simply a piano. My father taught me, she said. It was the one impractical thing he insisted on. He came into the room. He looked at the piano. It was a fine instrument, a Broadwood, she had noted on the inventory, dating from approximately 1812. She had dusted it herself, in the 2nd week, because it had needed it, and because she did not know if it was something she could ask a maid to do without understanding how the Duke regarded it. My mother's, he said. I know. He looked at her. Mrs. Whitmore told you. She told me a great deal, Agnes said. She did not want me to do anything accidentally that might be wrong. He looked at the piano for a long time. Then he said, quietly, she played Haydn in the mornings. I cannot remember the specific works. Agnes said nothing for a moment. She had not planned to say what she said next. It was not calculated. It was simply accurate, and she was a person who offered accurate things. I know some Haydn, she said, if you wish to hear it. He turned to look at her. Something was in his face that she had not seen before. Not surprise exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has been handed something he did not know he needed and is now uncertain what to do with it. Another time, he said. His voice was slightly different, not rough but changed, like a note played in an altered key. Not tonight. She nodded. She gathered the inventory notes and went to the door. Miss Bowman. He was looking at the piano, not at her. My cravat, he said. Yesterday. In the study. She waited. It was wrong, he said. The left side. She had noticed it at the study door, and had not said anything, because she had not been certain it was her place. She had thought about it afterwards, the specific 5-degree list of the left fold, with the same minor irritation she felt about a flower that was not quite straight. It has been wrong the last 3 days, she said. He looked at her over his shoulder. You did not say. I was not certain it was my concern. He turned back to the piano. It is your concern, he said. Anything that is wrong in this house is your concern. She set down her inventory notes. She crossed the room. She straightened his cravat. 2 adjustments, the left fold and the pin placement. 12 seconds in total. His stillness during this was absolute, the stillness of someone who is not accustomed to being attended to and is deciding, privately, what to do with it. Straight, she said. and stepped back. He looked at her for a moment. She could not read his expression. She did not try. She retrieved her inventory notes from the piano lid where she had set them and left the room. She walked back to the estate office. She pressed one hand flat against the wall of the corridor for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and finished the inventory count. The crisis came in March, as crises tend to come, abruptly, from a direction she had not expected, involving money. A letter arrived from a firm of London solicitors, representing a consortium of investors who held a claim on 3 of Denvale's tenant farms. A financial arrangement predating the current Duke, structured in 1809 by his father in circumstances the letter described with careful legal vagueness. The consortium was calling the claim. They had a right to do so under the original terms, which Agnes pulled from the estate archive within 20 minutes of reading the letter. The right was real. The terms were genuine. The calling of the claim would require either a payment of £1,100 within 90 days, or the transfer of the 3 farms. Agnes read the original agreement 3 times. She made notes. She went to find the Duke. She laid the letter, the original agreement, and her notes on the study desk before him and said, "There is a problem. I believe there is also a solution. Let me show you both." He read the letter, he read the agreement, he was very still throughout. The problem was genuine. £1,100 in 90 days was not a figure the current estate cash flow could easily meet, not without liquidating something. The solution Agnes had found was in the agreement's own terms. Clause 14, paragraph 3, which specified that the claim could be forestalled for an additional year if the estate demonstrated in writing, before a named solicitor, a clear financial improvement plan with documented evidence of current estate health. No one had used Clause 14. She did not think anyone had read it carefully enough to find it. She pointed to it. She set her documented account review beside the agreement, opened to the page that showed the recovered margins, the corrected expenditure, the projection for the year. If we present this to the consortium's solicitor as evidence of estate health and a plan, we buy 12 months, she said. In 12 months, at the current recovery rate, the estate will have the capital position to either pay the claim or renegotiate from a position of strength. He read Clause 14. He read it again. He set the agreement down and looked at Agnes's account documentation. He turned 3 pages. He looked at the projection. "You found this in an hour," he said. "I was already familiar with the accounts," Agnes said. "The clause was the only thing I needed to find." He looked at her. The measuring attention, but something in it had, across these weeks, become different. Less the assessment of an unknown quantity, and more the regard of someone who has resolved the calculation, and is now simply looking at the answer. "Can you draft the documentation?" he said. "I already have a preliminary version." She produced it from her case. "It needs your review and your solicitor's approval. But the structure is there." He took the draft. He read it entirely, with the focused attention he brought to everything. He turned 2 pages. He read the projection appendix. He set it down. "You wrote this in the time since you received the letter," he said. It was not quite a question. "The account knowledge was already organized," Agnes said. "I simply directed it." He was quiet. Then he said, "Miss Bowman, I want to tell you something." She waited. He rarely preluded remarks. The prelude meant the remark was different in kind. "I hired an investigator before I wrote to you," he said. "In November, I had a report compiled on your history, your father's estate, the Ashworth arrangement, your work at Harcastle." He met her eyes directly. "You deserve to know that I knew what I was hiring before I hired it. What I did not know, and could not have known from a report, is the quality of your judgment in motion." Agnes was still. She thought about this. The investigator, the report, the research. She had suspected something of the kind, but suspected and confirmed were different. "I would have done the same," she said finally. "Before taking a position, I would have researched the employer's estate, financial record, and household history as thoroughly as I could." "I know," he said. "You asked for the accounts before you accepted." There was a moment between them that was quiet and specific and entirely unperformed. "Thank you for telling me," Agnes said. "You should have known from the beginning," he said. "That is the only thing I have done wrong in this arrangement." She gathered the documents. She was at the door before something made her turn. "The Haydn," she said. "I will play it tomorrow evening, if you wish." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I wish." She played for him the next evening, in the music room, for 40 minutes, while he sat in the chair by the window and listened with his eyes closed and his hands still in his lap. She played carefully, from memory, and she did not try to guess what his mother had played specifically. She played what she knew, what was true to the instrument and the room, and she let that be enough. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Thank you," he said. It was the quietest she had heard his voice. She closed the piano lid. She stood. She said, "Good night, Your Grace," and went back to her rooms, and she did not let herself think, until the door was closed and she was alone, about the fact that she was playing music in a dead woman's house, for a man she had come to understand better than she had understood any person in her adult life, and that this was more than she had accounted for when she had written her letter of acceptance in January. It was not rescue, she held to that, but it was something older and quieter than anything she had a proper name for. The Investor Consortium's solicitor was a man named Mr. Birch, who arrived at Denvale House in the second week of March, with the efficient manner of someone who expected to close a transaction, and was prepared to be cordial about it. He was shown to the drawing room. Agnes was asked by the Duke to be present. She brought 3 volumes of documentation. The original agreement with Clause 14 marked the estate account review for the previous 12 months with the recovery margins highlighted. The 6-week account summary she had prepared, which showed in specific figures, supplier recovery of £340, corrected expenditure of £93, projected annual improvement of £140 above the previous 4-year average, the current and projected health of the Denvale estate. She also brought the projection forward, which she had extended across 3 years, because she believed Mr. Birch was a man who would be moved by a longer picture if the shorter one was compelling, and she had made both pictures as specific as she could. She did not argue. She did not plead. She presented. Mr. Birch read Clause 14. He read the account recovery. He reviewed the supplier contracts. He was a thorough man, and she gave him time to be thorough, because thoroughness was her ally. He turned pages. He asked 2 questions, about the methodology of the supplier recovery margin, and about whether the projection was based on committed contracts or estimates. Agnes answered both questions with specific reference to the documents. Committed contracts for the supplier recoveries. A conservative estimate methodology for the projection, based on 3-year averages rather than current year peaks. Mr. Birch looked at the documents for another 10 minutes. He looked at the Duke, who had been present and silent throughout, in the particular way of a man who has decided not to speak, because the person speaking is doing it better than he could. "The Clause 14 documentation appears to satisfy the terms," Mr. Birch said at last. "I will need to confirm with the consortium, but the evidence of estate health and a substantiated improvement plan is, in my professional assessment, what the clause requires." Agnes said, "I have prepared a summary document for your consortium's review, to accompany the full file." She produced it. 3 pages, organized, clear. Mr. Birch took the summary. He looked at it. He looked at Agnes. "You have managed estate accounts of this complexity before, Miss Bowman?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, the nod of a man who has revised an assumption mid-process and is adjusting without making anything of it. He gathered the documents. He confirmed that he would be in contact within the fortnight. When he had gone and the drawing-room door was closed, the Duke stood. He looked at Agnes across the width of the room. "Clause 14, he said. "It was there," Agnes said. "It simply needed someone to read it." He crossed the room. He stopped before her, closer than the formal distance, not so close as to require comment. He looked at her with the full, direct attention he had never, in all the weeks she had been here, given her in quite this specific way, the look of someone who has stopped calculating and is simply seeing. "I would like to make a formal proposal," he said. Agnes kept very still. Of employment? She asked. I believe we already have one. Of marriage, he said. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, the wind moved against the east wing, where the new plaster was still setting. Agnes thought about it, not performatively, but genuinely, completely, the way she thought about every significant thing. She thought about what it would mean, what it would require, what it would offer. She thought about the investigator's report, and the accounts sent by post, and the tea set at her elbow in the third week, and the cravat, and the music room, and Clause 14, and the look on his face when she had mentioned Haydn. She thought about her father, who had taught her accounts before she could manage a needle and thread, and who had seen something in her before the world knew what to do with her, and who would not have believed any of it, and would also have believed every word. I will need to consider it, she said. Yes, he said. That is what I expected. The public occasion came sooner than anyone had planned for. Lord Alderton had arranged a dinner, in early April, to which he had invited precisely the people whose opinion he considered structurally important: 3 senior members of the county investment community, 2 neighboring estate owners, Lord and Lady Harcastle, and Lady Cecilia Forsyth and her mother. The stated purpose of the dinner was a spring gathering, an occasion of pleasant socializing. The unstated purpose was to make clear, in the presence of witnesses, who occupied what position in the social architecture of the Denvale situation. Agnes had been invited as a matter of course, in her official capacity. She had seen the guest list and understood its architecture immediately. She was not alarmed by it. She had managed harder rooms than this one. She wore her black dress. She had only the one good formal dress, which was a fact she had been managing for 3 years. It was well made, simply cut, and she had repaired the left sleeve seam herself in February, invisibly, with the care of someone who understood that every tool needed to be kept in working order. She arrived at the table with the household documentation the Duke had asked her to bring, an informal accounting of the estate's current health, which he had said he wanted available should questions arise. The dinner began well, as dinners always do. Lord Alderton presided with the authority of someone in his natural habitat. Lady Cecilia was placed near the Duke, correctly, by the seating arrangement Lord Alderton had presumably had some hand in. She was gracious, she was lovely, she was, Agnes could see, doing what she had been trained to do in this specific type of room, and she was doing it well. The moment came over the second course. Mr. Draper, one of the county investment figures, raised the matter of the Denvale Investor Consortium claim. He had heard about it. These things moved through the county's financial networks more quickly than they moved through post, and he raised it with the careful social indirection of someone making a point while appearing to make inquiry. I understood the claim had been called, Mr. Draper said, addressing the Duke. I was surprised to hear it had not yet been settled. It is being addressed through a clause in the original agreement, the Duke said. He said it simply, in the way he said everything. A clause, Mr. Draper said, with the specific inflection of skepticism that did not quite become a challenge. I was not aware the original terms contained an alternative resolution mechanism. Clause 14, paragraph 3, Agnes said. She was at the end of the table in the seat given to the household manager, which was a seat that was not quite of the dinner, and not quite separate from it, the position of someone who is present in a functional capacity, rather than a social one. Every head at the table turned toward her. Lady Cecilia's expression was unreadable. Lord Alderton's was not. It provides for a 12-month forestallment upon documented evidence of estate health and a clear improvement plan. We presented the documentation to Mr. Birch last week. Mr. Draper looked at her. And the documentation was adequate? Mr. Birch indicated it satisfied the clause's requirements, Agnes said. We expect formal confirmation within the fortnight. What documentation? Another gentleman asked. Sir Howe, one of the neighboring estate owners. Agnes opened the summary she had brought. She set it on the table. A 6-week account review, a supplier recovery analysis, a documented improvement plan, and a 3-year projection. I can summarize the key figures if it would be useful. The room had a quality, not silence, but the particular suspension of a room that has just received new information, and has not yet processed it. She summarized. She was not nervous. She had been managing account presentations since she was 17 and had sat across a kitchen table from Jeffrey Ashworth, with the estate ledgers between them, and made her case without a tremor. This room was larger. The stakes were higher. The principle was the same: accurate information, clearly presented, without argument. £340 recovered in supplier contracts, £93 corrected in expenditure accounts, £140 projected annual improvement above the 4-year average. The East Wing repair completed, the documented household operational record established, the coal contract restructured for 3-year savings. When she finished, the room was very still. Lord Alderton was looking at the summary she had set on the table. He was a man who understood numbers, and the table had heard a lot of them. His expression was not warm. It was the expression of a man who is reorganizing what he knows, privately, and is too disciplined to do it visibly. Mr. Draper said, "This is the work of 6 weeks?" "Yes," Agnes said. He looked at the Duke, who had been watching Agnes throughout the summary, with the quiet directness he always brought to things he was taking seriously. "Your Grace," Lady Cecilia said from her position near the Duke. Her voice was pleasant and carefully controlled. "You have made an unusual choice in your household management." "I have made a correct one," the Duke said. He did not raise his voice. He said it as he said accurate things. Simply. Finally. He looked at Lady Cecilia with the measured civility of someone who does not have a quarrel and is not going to have one. "Miss Bowman has improved the operational health of this estate substantially in 6 weeks. The numbers speak to that. I chose her because she is the right person for this work, and I was correct." Lady Cecilia smiled, a small, contained smile that acknowledged the statement without conceding anything. She was not destroyed by this. She was not meant to be. She was a woman who had been prepared by her world for a very specific outcome, and was now facing a different one, and she had enough intelligence and composure to do this without making it anyone else's scene. She turned the conversation. Agnes looked at the summary on the table. She looked at the room, the faces that were recalibrating. Not all of them, not completely, but enough. Enough that the architecture of the evening had shifted. The Duke rose after dinner. He had a word with Lord Harcastle, who shook his hand with the warm energy of a man who is very pleased about something. He crossed to where Agnes stood. "Come," he said quietly. He brought her to the center of the room, where the after-dinner gathering was assembled, and Lord Alderton was watching from his position near the window. He turned to face the company. He kept his voice measured and clear. "I should like to make something known to those who are present, as many of you are people whose counsel I value," he said. "I have asked Miss Bowman to accept an offer of marriage. She is considering the matter." A pause. "I want the people in this room to know that I would consider no other candidate equally suited, not by connection, not by title, not by any of the usual grounds. By quality, by the quality of her mind and her work and her character, which I have had the occasion to observe closely, and which I would not exchange for any credential a drawing-room could offer." The room received this in the way that rooms receive things that change them, with a moment of absolute suspension, and then a slow, distributed movement, like water finding a new level. Lord Alderton, near the window, looked at Agnes. He looked at his nephew. He said nothing. He turned his glass once in his hand, and the turning of the glass was the most private thing Agnes had seen him do, and she understood it for what it was. Lady Harcastle, across the room, met Agnes's eyes with an expression that was entirely warm and entirely clear. Lord Harcastle was beaming in the uncomplicated way of a man who had always known he was underutilizing someone and was relieved to be off the hook. Agnes stood in the center of the room and let herself be seen. She was not going to cry. She was not going to be overwhelmed. She was exactly herself, as she had always been, and the room was finally simply looking in the right direction. She looked at the Duke. He was looking at her, not with the measuring attention of the anteroom at Harcastle, not with the assessment of someone running a calculation. Simply looking, the way a person looks at something they have decided on. She took a breath. "I would like to continue considering the matter in private," she said, to the room. which was close enough to the truth to serve. For now I will return to my accounts. There was laughter, warm laughter, surprised laughter, the laughter of people who have encountered something unexpected and found it, against their expectations, good. Lord Alderton made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and was not quite anything else, and turned back to his window. Lady Cecilia, near the far side of the room, looked at Agnes for a long moment. She was not shattered. She was not made small. She simply looked, with the directness of someone who is seeing a thing clearly for the first time, and she nodded. A small, precise nod, between women, that acknowledged what it needed to acknowledge. Agnes nodded back. She went home, back to Denvale House, back to the estate office, back to the accounts. She sat at the desk for 20 minutes without picking up her pen. Then she picked it up. She had managed her father's estate alone at 17. She had sat across a table from Geoffrey Ashworth and made her case without a tremor. She had found the 93-pound gap, the Coldest linen overcharging, clause 14 in paragraph 3, the Haydn that a man who had not heard music in 4 years had needed to hear again. She could manage this. He proposed again in the garden, on a morning in late April when the ground was soft from the previous night's rain, and the first of the year's flowers had come up along the south wall. He found her there because she had been checking the wall drainage, a follow-on item from the east wing repair, which had surfaced a related concern about the garden's water management, and he came through the gate with his coat already on against the morning cold, and walked along the path to where she stood. He stopped beside her. He looked at the wall, then at the drainage channel she had been examining. "Improved," he said. "The standing water was causing damage to the mortar," she said. "The channel redirects it clear of the foundation." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the south wall, at the early flowers pushing up beside it. Then he turned to her. "I should like to say something," he said. "Not the public version, the true one." She waited. "I do not propose this because it is convenient, or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes," he said. "I propose it because you are the most precise and honest and capable person I have encountered in my adult life, and because this house has been better since you came. Not the accounts, the house itself." He paused. "You played the piano in the music room, and I sat in that chair, and I remembered things I had not been able to remember. That is not a small thing." Agnes looked at the south wall. She thought about it, genuinely, fully, in the manner she thought about everything that mattered. She thought about the estate office, and the 93 pounds and the tea at her elbow, and clause 14, and the cravat, and the garden drainage, and the fact that she had been managing things alone for 9 years, and that alone had always been sufficient, and had never quite been enough. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said again, simply, because it was a sufficient word. He reached out and took her hand, her bare hand, since she had removed her gloves for the drainage work, and held it for a moment, with the seriousness of someone making a commitment they have no intention of revising. Then he brought it to his lips, briefly, and released it. She looked at the south wall. She pressed her thumb against the revised drainage channel edge to confirm it was holding. It was holding. They were married in June, at the parish church, with Lord and Lady Harcastle in attendance, and Mrs. Whitmore in the front pew, in a very good grey dress she had produced from somewhere without comment. Lord Alderton attended without being asked, and stood with the austere bearing of a man who has been proved wrong about something significant, and is making a formal peace with it. Agnes wore pale blue. It was the first dress she had purchased for a reason other than utility, in 11 years, and she had chosen it with the same systematic care she brought to supplier contracts. Fabric, line, durability, whether it would serve well beyond the occasion for which it was made, she thought it would. In the 3 years that followed, she completed the estate account reform she had begun. The Denvale accounts were, by 1824, organized in a documented system that the neighboring estates, pressed by their own creditor difficulties, began requesting access to as a model. Agnes produced a clean version of the methodology, stripped of Denvale-specific figures, and shared it. Lord Alderton, who heard about this through the county network, came to the estate office one afternoon, and sat across from her without speaking for a moment. The Morris estate is using your account categories, he said. And the Haynes estate, Agnes said. They wrote in February. Lord Alderton nodded. He picked up the clean version of the methodology from her desk and read 2 pages. This is very good work, he said. Thank you, Agnes said. He set it down. He looked at her with the expression that was not warmth but was the sustained absence of opposition, which was, from him, what warmth looked like. My nephew has made a good choice, he said. Yes, Agnes agreed, without any particular modesty. He has. Lord Alderton almost smiled. He left without further comment. Their daughter Eleanor was born in the spring of 1824, named without discussion for the woman whose piano still stood in the music room, whose accounts Agnes had preserved in the estate archive, and whose mornings at the keyboard had shaped a man into someone who could, eventually, hear music again. Eleanor had her father's eyes and her mother's particular quality of focused attention, which was evident even at 5 months in the way she looked at things she was interested in, steadily, without distraction, as though she were taking an inventory. James watched this from across the room and said, "She is counting something." "She is counting the light on the ceiling," Agnes said, without looking up from the account summary she was reviewing. "She has been doing it for 10 minutes. He looked at his daughter, he looked at his wife. He did not say anything for a moment. He simply looked, with the full, direct attention he had been learning, across the years of this marriage, to let people see. Agnes could feel him looking. She had always been able to feel it. She set down her pen and looked back. The estate was solvent and well managed. The south wall drainage held. The accounts were in order. The piano in the music room was played every morning before the household properly stirred, sometimes by Agnes and sometimes, on the mornings he rose first, by the Duke himself, carefully, imperfectly, finding his way back to things he had lost, and was now, with time and with company, beginning to recover. Eleanor, in her crib by the window, turned her head toward the sound of it. The house was warm. All of them were in it. This was, Agnes thought, not dramatically, not with any excess of feeling, but with the steady certainty of someone recording an accurate fact. Enough. It was more than enough. It was the most precise and honest version of a life she could have constructed, and she had built it with everything she had, and it would hold,